My big toe was called mine, not because I'm so proud of it. It's because if it's not your experience, then it can't be your truth. So my big toe is basically based on my experience, my research, and my conclusions. And my big toe should just be perhaps a structure or a platform for each person to build their own big toe. It's not something to be believed. Belief is a problem. Belief gets in the way. Where you have a belief, you put yourself behind a wall. You don't then let in other information that conflicts with that belief. So beliefs are always a problem to understanding the big picture. So I would not encourage anybody to believe my model, but to look at it and see if it applies to their life. So I'm a physicist. Let's just give you a little overview at my big toe. It's a model of everything. It's a big toe, not just a toe. Mostly when you hear about toes, they're not really about everything. They're a theory of physics. They're a theory of fundamental science within this universe, the science of our universe. That's what they are. And what they leave out is everything that is subjective. In other words, consciousness, attitudes, feelings, emotions, everything that's in the subjective world. And if you think about it, most of our world that is important to us does fall in the subjective side. The objective world of physicists, and I'm a physicist, but the objective world of physics is basically just a subset of the world that we live in and interact in. And it's, I would say, a minor subset. It's the stage, it's the props, it's all the stuff. Important things in our life, like who should I marry? Should I take this job or that job? That sort of thing. Big things that change our lives, change our thinking. What book should I read? All of these choices are not objective choices. They're all subjective choices. So most of our more meaningful experiences like love, justice, truth, all these things are subjective, or at least have large components of subjectiveness in them. So a theory of everything has to also be a theory of the subjective world as well as the objective world. Otherwise, you've just got a little toe, which is just a theory of the objective world. So my toe is a bit different. And mine started with, or I should say, mine starts with consciousness as a fundamental. And the reason that I came to that is that I was in graduate school in physics, working on my PhD in experimental nuclear physics. And I found out just quite by accident that I could debug my computer code. Now, back in those days, these are the old days in computer code. I'm talking about boxes of cards, that sort of thing. And debugging was a huge problem. Not like today where you have debuggers and instant terminals and access to the computers and so on. In those days, there was a big central computer and it took up a whole building, and it was not as powerful as your telephone is today. It was probably only 100th or 1,000th as powerful as your cell phone is today. And the whole school, the whole university ran on that one computer. There were no desktops. So you got to stand in line in a queue, and if you got 1 or 2 jobs run a week, well, lucky you. So if that job ran and bombed because you had an error, well, you just lost a week for your research, you see. So debugging was something people spent a lot of time focused on so that they didn't have to wait forever to get their research done and their ideas worked out. So in any case, I found that in my mind, I could bring up a picture in a meditation state. I learned to meditate while I was in graduate school. And I learned because the advertisement said that you could get by with less sleep. And in graduate school, that just was a real big plus for me. So that's why I learned how to meditate. And anyway, in this meditation state, I could bring up a picture of my output, my printout, scroll through all the lines in code, and the lines that had errors in them, had problems in them, would just show up red. That was an intention of mine. I wanted to be able to see them. And I just did this kind of on a wild hair, kind of a lark. Well, I'm in a meditation state. Let's see what I can do. And I checked it out, and it was correct. Those lines of code were actually the ones that had problems. And in these days, a problem wasn't because necessarily you coded it incorrectly. Maybe the key punch was just off a hair. If those little holes didn't line up exactly right with the reader, you'd get an error. So you may have done all the right things, but the machine was a little off that punched holes. So that, as a physicist, that hit me like a ton of bricks. What was going on here? How could I do that? There was no physical process going on. It was entirely a mental process. And how could my mental process find things like key punch errors? That was just crazy. So I played with it, and I found that I got better with it with practice, and that I could decode my stuff, debug it very, very quickly. So as a physicist, what that told me was that my idea that reality is measurable. If it's not measurable, in other words, this is called what's the word for it? It's like if you can't interact with it, if you're talking about something, you say, oh, this is real, but you can't interact with it. You can't see it, can't smell it.
Operationalism?
It's an operational definition of reality. Exactly. So as a physicist, that was my attitude toward reality. It's an operational reality. So I realized that wasn't true, that there was more to reality than just what you could measure, what you could do operations on. It had another whole component to it that was more tied up to mental than to physical. It was subjective, not objective. So I just kind of had that as an idea. Wow, I'd like to find out more about this, because as a physicist, my job was to model reality, to understand how reality works. And I realized there was this whole big piece of reality that was outside of what I had thought was possible. So I just walked around with that, and I didn't really know what to do about it or how to deal with it, other than it was there. And it wasn't a matter of, did I just imagine that? That was ridiculous. Of course I didn't imagine. I can't imagine that, oh, this hole's, is 1/100th of a millimeter, too far to the right. That's not something you can imagine. So in any case, when I got out of graduate school, took a job, and as luck would have it, about probably 4, 5, 6 months into my first job as a physicist, I was
nuclear physicist, correct?
Yeah, nuclear. Not high energy nuclear, but low energy nuclear. We worked with a big Van de Graaff accelerator. So, 5 MeV was about as far as we could go as far as energy went. So anyway, I was introduced to Bob Monroe. I got to meet Bob Monroe. Now, Bob Monroe had written books called Journey Out of the Body, and at that time, and I read that book, and my opinion of it was, well, if this is probably just trying to sell books, this guy's making up a story. It's an interesting story, but he's just making it up, and he's just
and you read
to
this
sell books.
After your transcendental meditation sessions?
No, I read this like 3 years after I had become, about 3 years after I learned how to do meditation. It was a long time. I got a job, and actually it was my boss tossed me this book by Bob Monroe and said, read this book. And I read it. And
just read it because it was your
really? Boss. You got to be kidding. Journeys Out of the Body? Boss? Really? But I read it, and I told him, he's either making it up to get money, or it's indicative of another piece of reality that we just don't know about. But how can we tell? Is he for real or is he not? Because at that point, I was open to reality being bigger than just the physical because of my experiences some 3 years ago, in graduate school, being able to debug code. So I was open-minded to perhaps there's more. And the more is in mental space, in mind space, not in physical space. So we went out
just to get some acronyms out of the way. There's PMR, which is physical matter reality.
Right.
And then there's NPMR, which is non-physical matter reality.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and basically that definition is that PMR is what we call our physical universe. It's what we call physical. Okay. And that the NPMR is everything else, anything else. So when you dream, the reality in your dream is in NPMR. It's not part of the physical world. So it's just terminology that lets me differentiate the physical world from everything else. So anyway, my boss found out where Bob Monroe lived. It wasn't that far from where we worked. And we made an appointment to go see him. And I did. And he was a very wealthy guy. He didn't need book sales. He was way past the money that book sales bring in. And he had a personality like an engineer. He was very, he was bright, but very factual, very, very clear. He wasn't fuzzy-headed and kind of on the crazy side. And he told us that he had just built a lab to study consciousness because he wanted to bring science to this experience of his. So he wanted to study it, and he was looking for some scientists that would help him study it. So I shot my hand up in the air. I've been a student like for 30 years. So, put my hand up in the air right away. And about a month or so later, I was making trips, every week, out to the lab and starting to actually, first we had to build equipment in the lab. We built equipment with EEG. We built GSRs and other things to.
What are GSRs?
That's a galvanic skin response. It basically measures skin resistivity, the resistance of your skin to a very small electrical DC current. And that changes based on mind state. If you relax or meditate, the resistance goes up. If you're very excited, it goes down,
So like a neurophysiological measurement.
Yeah, it's something that tells you a little bit about something in mind. We didn't, we were trying to measure whatever we could, and there's not a lot that measures things that are primarily mental. So EEG and GSR were two of the things that we could do and we could afford. So we built most of the equipment. We wired the lab. We kind of set things up, and then we got in the booths, and Bob would come up and teach us what he knew about observing and interacting with this larger reality, which is outside this physical universe. In other words, mind space. And of course, myself and an electrical engineer came with me. So we were both in this together. We both worked at the same place. And our idea was, well, if this turns out to be a lot of hocus pocus, we're out of here. But if it turns out that we really learn something, then great. We were both excited about the possibilities of learning something. So the deal was that we'd help Bob and we would be free. We wouldn't cost him anything. And that he would teach us so we could experience it. Because if we just examined him, well, you can, if you learn about something that you study, but you've never experienced, it's never quite real. We wanted to experience it so we could find it out for ourselves, how real it was, made it more objective for us, even though it was still in a subjective space. So he did. We came out there a couple of days a week, and he tried to teach us to experience mental space.
If you enjoyed this Toe clipping, then the full video is linked in the description. You should also sign up for Toe Mail, which is again in the description and the pinned comment. You'll receive immediate access to all exclusive updates from the Theories of Everything podcast. It also helps me communicate directly with the core Toe community. You'll also receive my top 10 toes. Think of it as the intellectual version of Quentin Tarantino's Obsession.